in terms of like percentage-wise, how much of your evidence chapters come out of your commonplace book versus new research? Just to spitball a percentage.
Yeah, I would say, like, let's say I'm starting this new book, I'll go back through and I might find, 100 or 200 cards that will become sort of the core of a book. But ultimately, I'm now going to go off and fill this with new material. And one of the tough things for me, because I wrote Obstacle, Ego, and then I wrote this book called The Daily Stoic, which is like a page a day of Stoic philosophy. In like 3 years, I burned through like 10 years of material. And so for stillness, one of the things I really had to do, although there's some characters that repeat, is I had to sort of go like, I have to get like basically all new people. And so that involved a lot of reading and a lot of, going down blind alleys. But it was the decision to go like, hey, my cupboard's getting a little bare and I've got to go, I've got to go back to the grocery store.
It was interesting to see which non-Stoics had multiple appearances in Stillness is the Key. I mean, Mr. Rogers, Fred Rogers, shows up to illustrate several points. Dorothy Day, who I didn't know about, apparently a Catholic nun, comes up several times, and as does Anne Frank, but also and MLK, but then also Johnny Cash, who you usually don't think of in a philosophical sense.
Yeah.
So was this positive? Was this brand new research, or do you have Johnny Cash in your commonplace book?
So, I mean, I'm a Johnny Cash fan, but what happened, I know how that process, I know that one very specifically. I was reading Stephen Pressfield's book, The Artist's Journey, and he talks about Roseanne Cash's memoir. And so I read Roseanne Cash's memoir, and I thought it was really interesting. I got a bunch of stuff. That's where I got the story in Stillness is the Key about relationships, where Johnny Cash is. And I thought, I didn't, I just thought of mostly as Johnny Cash as a musician, and I'd seen a movie about him. And so I got really into listening to Johnny Cash. And then I read a biography about Johnny Cash. And then I read his memoir. And so you just twist and turn down these things. The Mr. Rogers one is funny. When I wrote in the proposal about Mr. Rogers, I was really excited. I was like, nobody knows about this guy. They just think about him as this, host from a children's television show. I was so excited. And then in between the time the proposal and the book came out, it's like Tom Hanks is starring in a movie about him. And then there's been like multiple biographies, and he's had this whole resurgence. But these were all just kind of chance encounters with different things. Dorothy Day, I read, someone mentioned her in a book, and they mentioned her in a way that it seemed like everyone was supposed to know who Dorothy Day was. So I read a book that was a biography of Dorothy Day and one other person. And so it comes from just the decision to go, or even the admission, like, I've never heard of that person. I don't know anything about them. I'm going to fix that. And then you just keep going.
It's interesting you mentioned Stephen Pressman's book, which is sort of, a big idea type book. Do you read many big idea type books, or do you find yourself more rooted in ancient or classic books or biographies or things like that? How do you mix up your reading?
Yeah, I tend not to read a lot of new books, except if they're written by a person that I really respect or admire. So like anytime Stephen Pressfield publishes something, I read it. Mark Manson's a friend, so I read his stuff. I was just going to mention, I really liked one of the best big idea books I've read this year. I read David Epstein's book Range, which I think is like just fantastic. But it's funny, like I was talking to him, I read the book, and I was like, here's an interesting story about, I was like, the book is basically pitting sort of specialists versus generalists. And his ultimate argument is that range is more powerful. And I was like, this seemed like this sort of, the Spartans were specialists and the Athenians were generalists. And he was like, oh my God, I wish we'd talked when the book was coming out, because that's like a perfect analogy to draw. And that's really what I think the process is like you're out reading and experiencing things, and then that is bouncing off this database of examples and anecdotes and facts and stories that you have, and the books come from the connections between those two things.